obviously, yeah, I'm Robert, 2015 Nuffield Scholar, and my topic was best practice in alternative egg production. And for people that, everybody has opinions about eggs, but for people that don't know what an alternative egg is, basically talking about any alternative to cages, because we do cages well, and we don't always do other things quite as well. So the investor for this scholarship was the Australian Egg Corporation, and I'd particularly like to thank a couple of the employees there, departing CEO James Kellaway, as well as Kai Jansen, who was here last night, and Jojo Jackson, who also was responsible for my interactions, and they were very helpful. Obviously, family, critical part of any Nuffield Scholarship. So I have a wife there, that's the one on the right. That's Megan, then Annabelle on the left, and Harriet, who was born 2 days after I got back from the CSC. And I was pretty glad that I made it back in time. The last few days of CSC were pretty anxious, and I only just made it back through sickness. My late grandfather, I'd like to acknowledge him today, because initially he was of the view that anything that takes you away from hard work on the farm is probably a negative thing. But in the end, he came to, I believe he came to really appreciate the honour that it is to be a Nuffield Scholar. And so he was very supportive, and that made it a lot easier within the business to be able to take the time to do this. And of course, everyone else, when you become a Nuffield Scholar, usually it's not through simply you just happen upon an application form online. It often seems to be that people give you a bit of a tap on the shoulder. And I went to a PICS conference in 2014, and 5 people tapped me on the shoulder or kicked me in the backside, whichever way you want to look at it. And that was a catalyst for me to reapply. So I'm a 3rd generation egg farmer. It's a family business. My father is engaged in the business, but he in fact is an accountant. He was here yesterday. And so I was raised in Brisbane, completely not on the farm. But I used to love going to the farm, and so it was a passion of mine to one day work there if I got the opportunity. My role, I did end up getting the opportunity. I'll put the next one up as well, because I had a former life as a corporate lawyer, and I'm largely rehabilitated now and accepted by the human race. But when I initially left the law and came into the business, I had no idea how I was going to go, because I knew that it wouldn't be the same as when you go there to the farm on holidays and you ride around with your cousins on motorbikes and go shooting and so on all the time. I knew it'd be harder than that. So I went there on a sort of a trial basis, and I'm still there. And from 2010, I started heading up the packing and sales and distribution end of the business, and ever since it's been happy days. This is some of the stuff I do. Most years I did get to take the eggs to the Royal Easter Show, which is good. Last time my uncle took it, we didn't win, so he's like, I'm not going again. You can keep doing that. So that's a fun little thing I get to do. I love seeing our product on shelves. That's a Coles, for what it's worth. And occasionally I do get to drive in our little fleet of trucks. We deal with a fair variety of climate in Molong. So last year, my first day back at work after the GFP, I'd been travelling in the Northern Hemisphere, enjoying lovely days of 30-something degrees, and I came back and there was snow for the first time in 15 years in Molong. But most of the time it looks more like the picture in the middle. So we're not, it's not a bad rainfall area, we're pretty reliable, but nonetheless it's more often less cover on the ground than more. At the moment it looks amazing. I probably should have put a photo up of how it is at the moment. Just while I've been on my scholarship, we've installed this facility here, which it's not terribly common in Australia. This is the only one of its particular kind in Australia. But multi-tier systems are becoming more and more common for barn and even for free-range egg production, and I'm going to discuss that a bit further today. But that's something that we've been learning about whilst I've been on my scholarship. I've been seeing it overseas and coming home and trying to think, well, how can I learn from what I've seen and put it into practice? And here's an ad in case anybody's ever anywhere near Sydney, Western Sydney, Canberra, the whole Central West. I got a phone call from a lady, it would be 2 months ago now, and some of you might know Lynne Cornelius, or know of her brother George, he was acknowledged last night at the dinner as a good friend of Jim Gelch. And it just so happened that she moved from Canberra to a set of ranges just northwest of Melbourne. And I got this phone call out of the blue from a lady saying, "Do you ever come to Melbourne? Can I get your eggs in Melbourne? It's the one thing I miss about living in Canberra." And I said, "Well, as it happens, every now and then I do go to Melbourne, and I'll try and help you out next time I'm down there." And then 15 minutes later, I get a phone call saying, "Oh, and I went on your website and I see you're a Nuffield Scholar. I got this connection to Jim." So that made me really glad that I'd said that I'd help her. Because usually you say to people, "Listen, I can only get to where I can get to." But she said she'd shout me lunch, so that was pretty good. She'll even take the train in from wherever she is and meet me in Melbourne. So in October, I'm looking forward to catching up with Lynne Cornelius. Back to the study topic. So to expand it a little further, what was I really looking at? Best practice. I made it very broad because I thought, well, then I can look at anything. And I got an excuse to go to any kind of barn or free range operation anywhere around the world and say that I'm just there to study what they're doing. But over time, it really evolved away from some of the hands-on welfare. Some of it is still important and an element to it, but it became a broader question for the Australian industry. What are we doing? What's our direction? What are the big themes? And there are handbooks that are written specific to different breeds of chickens about when you're going to turn your lights on, or when you're going to how many calories do they need to eat to hit certain production targets and so on. So it wasn't going to be of huge value for me to try and become the scientific expert on those things. But in terms of our industry, we've got a great deal of uncertainty, and it's part of the reason that there's been an ongoing egg shortage this year across the country, is that the industry is in a bit of a state of confusion about where do we invest, what do we do next. So alternative systems seem popular. The consumer appears to want them. Retailers tell us that they have trouble selling caged eggs. If you look at their pricing structure, that does give a bit of a clue as to why that is the case, but nonetheless, we're working in that environment, so what are we going to do to respond? Can we just do better at the alternative egg production so that the numbers stack up better for us? What is the best way forward for the industry, or is it too late? Have we gone down a path where we actually can't turn around, we're committed, and we're just passengers on a train that's already shot through the cross? I can't really think of a good metaphor there. The horse is bolted and the gate, it's too late to shut the gate. We'll go there. Now, one of the challenges when you don't go anywhere for poultry is biosecurity, and James alluded to it as well in his discussion, and you just can't go to farm after farm every day. So it's a real challenge to try and find good places to go to, and I believe that I was really blessed to get to a couple of really good ones. At the same time, the point of my little picture up here is that people will tell you, we want to make sure you've not been anywhere near any other farms in the last few days to a week even. But then you go to their farm and the chickens are wandering around outside, and you don't know, wild birds are coming and going, and they're living in a wasteland essentially in that case. That's a heritage breed of chicken in the north of Scotland on a farm run by a Nuffield scholar, Gordon, for those who met him at the CSC. Anyway, it is a lovely farm, and everything's, I don't have any problem with it, but it's just an interesting factor that biosecurity is really important, but at the same time, we're putting our chickens outside and opening them up to any kind of risk. So I was very fortunate to get into the Lakes Free Range in the UK. I'm going to use these as case studies, I suppose, of farms that are kind of typical for their industry, but also at the same time leaders and operating really, really smart operations. The common characteristics, pride in their brand, attention to detail. You can see it in everything that they do. Herbrooks were a great example. They put a new driveway in on one of their farms, and they planted 6 or 7 metre high trees, just so that people within 2 years are going to see this as being established and really lovely. And it wasn't 1 or 2 trees, it was more like 80. So they're, serious money going into these sort of things. And they told me that, a lot of it is the first impression that you create when someone comes in the driveway. And when I pulled into the Lakes Free Range, I'd never seen a packing shed for eggs that looked like that. That was amazing and really, really beautiful. That top big glass section is actually the meeting room that they take all of their customers and suppliers to if they're going to have a meeting. That's the boardroom. And you go up there and you look down on the water feature and so on, and you just think these guys, well, if you're one of their customers, you probably think these guys are making a lot of money. But at the same time, if you're thinking they're doing things right and they're investing for the future, they're not here today, gone tomorrow. This you might have seen in one of James's pictures as well. That's kind of typical old school rearing of chickens. Is you do it on the floor. That shed has to be held at about 35 degrees initially when the birds go in, so you're burning a lot of gas or some other kind of energy, and it's not a very pleasant environment for a person, but you're keeping the chickens warm and they get off to a good start. These guys were being creative, like within the context that they're existing in. There's not a lot of money to put in new rearing facilities. Having said all that about how they're investing for the future, this is a company that is investing in new rearing. And they've come up with this design here with these funny little canopies that they're all on winches so they can go up and down. And they, in fact, heat the floor in strips underneath the canopies. So the chicks can choose whether they want to stay at the higher temperature and burrow into the nest, the sort of litter material on the floor, and stay warmer, or they can, at their own leisure, move in and out and get to the feed and water, which is in the aisles. And then they open up the rest of the shed. There's a false wall there that shed's about twice as long as this section. And these parts here open up as well as the birds get older, and they teach them to climb by jumping onto these platforms. And that's their way of dealing with the challenge of training a bird to fit into an alternative system. If you're putting a chicken in a cage, if you reared it on the floor and it goes into a cage, well, it'll lay its egg in the cage. If you rear it in a cage and put it in a cage, it'll lay its egg in the cage. And the egg will end up on the conveyor belt either way. If you put a bird into an alternative system, much like this one, there are some nest boxes there that you might be able to spot along the side, and the rest of it is a sea of chicken. And those chickens, if they lay their eggs where they are on the floor, those eggs they're not supposed to be used for first grade retail sale. I won't say it doesn't happen, but certainly best practice is that you discard those eggs or send them for processing at best, because you can't be sure how long they've been there. So the goal with alternative egg production is to get the chickens to lay their eggs in a nest box with a conveyor right beside it, and then those eggs can be sold. Again, this is fairly typical for the UK, this sort of flat deck system. There might be 1 or 2 platforms in there. The manure in that system is dropping down off a slatted floor until the end of the batch, and then once the birds go out, they tear up the floor, put in the bobcats or other equipment, front-end loaders, and clean it out and start again. This is the American style of cage-free or alternative egg production. So this is Herbrooks, 5 tiers high in this case, and it looks like a giant cage. Essentially it is a giant cage, but like it's a really big cage. We're talking 120 metres long, 16 metres wide, and it looks about 8 metres high. They can replace the air in that shed within a minute full replacement. That's how many fans they stick on these sheds, and that's a huge energy consumption, but their power cost is substantially cheaper. These guys are based in Michigan, so a lot of the time they're not really dealing with high temperatures. They're more dealing at the lower end with the minus 10 and 15 degrees, a lot of snow around, all that sort of thing. But nonetheless, they build these enormous sheds. On our entire farm, we have 130,000 layers, plus the birds in rearing. But one of these sheds is about 100 to 110,000, but they had other sheds that had over 130,000 in single sheds, which is astonishing numbers. They have millions of birds spread over several square kilometres in different little campuses. Very high tech, the Americans. You can see all these computer control systems and numbers and things. I was actually fortunate enough to see this egg grader being manufactured. I went to Europe in October. I went to America in May, and I just happened to see them making this enormous grader at the Moba factory in Holland. And I said, "Oh, where's that going?" They said, "Oh, it's going off to Herbrooks." I was like, "Who are Herbrooks?" Anyway, just so happened I met some people who introduced me to some people who connected me with Herbrooks, and so I got to see the grader again. I like graders because they're really helpful. It's a funny thing, when you look at that picture, this is the same system but inside the system, and there's a lot of space. When you looked at that other picture on the previous slide of the English system where the birds are all on one tier, they really do look like they're packed in there. Now, they've got room to move around, but they do tend to mill around as well. In fact, that particular farm had a problem where some random time in the afternoon, the birds would just mill on the one spot and smother a couple of them. And they couldn't figure out why. It was just a real problem. But anyway, you go into these sheds, they're still 9 birds a metre, equivalent roughly. But you can't see the birds. They're all disappeared off to places. And part of that's the white bird is a flightier bird. It goes away from you typically, whereas the brown birds you saw in our picture on our farm, most of Australia has brown birds. They come to you. They're more curious than afraid. So all these things, very nice. America's different to the UK, and Australia's somewhere in the middle. But this is where it sort of kicks in for Australia and what's going to happen next for our industry. The US is in a lot of strife. I was fortunate enough to be invited to go to the United Egg Producers meeting in Washington at the very start of June, and it was really quite a fascinating experience because they were all talking about the fact that in February this year there were just day after day flurries of announcements by retailers and food service companies and restaurants, catering chains announcing that they were going to go cage-free. And we've seen a number of announcements in Australia about targets to go cage-free and to not sell caged eggs anymore. But in America, it got really rough. It was like firm. They're putting dates on things, and they're just announcing it without talking to the producers at all. In some cases, they would ring them up to say, "Oh, we're going to announce this." In one case of a company whose name you would recognise, the producer said back to them, "Have you considered the food stamp program?" which is a substantial part of this company's revenue. Food stamps are only allowed to be used for cheaper products and healthier products. So caged eggs were permitted on the food stamp program. They are permitted in the food stamp program. Free-range, cage-free eggs, they're seen as a luxury item, so they weren't permitted in the food stamp program. And these guys said, "Oh, no, we hadn't really thought about that." So they pushed their announcement back by a week, and they still went ahead with it. So then the industry turned around and said, "Oh, well, we'll lobby the government to let them use cage-free eggs in the food stamp program." And I was sitting there thinking, why not lobby the government to say, no, stick with the caged eggs, and you might not have to convert all your sheds. But anyway, they're looking at having to convert 230 million hens in about 8 to 10 years, which is probably impossible. The reason is, unless they take out the same rate of production that they're putting in, they're just going to end up with an oversupply. And the price is so finely balanced. And when you're talking about millions of birds on some of these farms, they're not operating on huge margins. And so if they add 5% birds through increasing their cage-free production, they're just going to completely destroy the price and make it unviable to put in any more facilities. So they've got a real dilemma. They can take out old sheds, and as they naturally come up, they can replace them. And if they're working with some of the retailers said, yes, we'll take some supply gradually increasing. Others said, we don't want a single cage-free egg until the day that we want 100% cage-free eggs. So as you can imagine, that's really reasonable to deal with. When you're talking across a range of sizes, you need to have batches of different ages. You can't just turn up one day and say, turn to the chickens and say, please start laying today with the cage-free eggs. Can this happen here? It is already started. Some people might have heard Hungry Jack's have been advertising the fact that they've gone cage-free. McDonald's have said that they're going to go cage-free. Aldi have said that they're going to go cage-free. Woolworths are looking at 2018 officially, said they're going to go cage-free. An open secret in the industry is that nobody thinks that that's achievable. And they tried a trial in Canberra and they lost market share. I don't know how much because I'm not in that group of elite people, and I couldn't tell you even if I did. But it was substantial enough that they abandoned that trial early, and they've been selling caged eggs there ever since. Nonetheless, they still have got their announcement in public, and there's a lot of face to be lost if they turn around and back out of it now. Nonetheless, well, what's our response? Whether or not the supermarkets lose face, in a way it's not necessarily, well, it doesn't have to be our problem. I mean, it kind of can be. We can be a partner with the supermarkets. We don't have to be adversarial with the supermarkets and other retailers, but nonetheless, it's not up to us necessarily to just do what they say if the consumers aren't ready to pay a premium for that product. And I'll come to that in later recommendations. But this is my view anyway, is having gone away to study alternative egg production, I've come back and thought, we need to keep our cages. They are substantially easier, we do it well, and even if we've got to do these other things and we want to do them better, absolutely, we should nonetheless, as producers and as farmers, we should be united around the fact that cages are legitimate, they're good for the bird. The reason they came in the first place was to take the birds away from a lot of diseases and issues that they were having, and you get a lot less waste of life. You put 10,000 birds in a shed and at the end you've got 9,800. And if you do the same thing with a free-range batch, there's little chance that you've even got 9,000. And this is probably the rationale, and I suppose this presentation today is pitched to a Nuffield crowd, but it's also, I had half in mind what I've got to say to the egg industry when I get a chance to have a chat to them. And this is something where if you're a free-range producer and you're quite happy that cage guys get hammered and the regulations change, well, that's not necessarily a good long-term position for you, because in a way you're better off to keep a premium and to have other people doing that base load electricity, if you like. Cages are the coal of the egg industry. And then there's this one. First they came for the socialists. I won't read it all out. You're probably aware of this very famous quote regarding the Nazis and the danger of being silent while other people are oppressed. In New South Wales at the moment, you could substitute greyhounds or greyhound owners and trainers for one of those socialists or trade unionists. Probably not the Jews, we're not quite at that stage yet, but in fact for any agricultural, or for any one of our industries, there are issues where people would like to see some of us put out of business, and whether that's animal agriculture, whether it's pigs, whether it's your dairy guys, whether it's feedlot beef, whether it's GM cropping, all these things, people are not basing it on science. There's a lot of a lot of superstition behind people's views, and it's irrational. And if we don't sometimes unite together across industries, as well, like across categories of our industry, then they will come for us and there'll be nobody left. A bit dramatic, I suppose, but go with it with me. One of the other things I found, free range is not for everyone, and nor should it be set up everywhere. You go to some locations and it's just not a good spot for it. It might be that you have a high rainfall and so you have a very picturesque range area because it's mostly green. At the same time, you've probably got a lot of puddles a lot of the time on your range. And so the birds, they come out of the sheds, and I saw examples in Europe because they do have a much wetter environment. The birds, they open the doors, literally they rush out. Not all of them, but I mean some of the birds rush out to get to the puddle. And you wouldn't think that it makes any sense. They've got clean water inside that would be delicious and fresh. Instead, they rush to these puddles and they drink out of the puddle and pick up who knows what. One of the things that we probably need to look at in Australia is not to get too, it's in the same vein as my first point really, is not to get too prescriptive about how as an industry we do these alternative egg production. Some people want to limit free range to only the flat deck sort of system where the birds are all on one level. Others are happy to have any sort of multi-tier system. It depends how you define it. If we go prescriptive and say, oh, it has to be this, it has to be that, you can still end up with outcomes that are unintended. Some of the multi-tier systems can have great access to the outdoors, others not so much. So in my view, it needs to be based on outcomes, not appearance. And I suppose I've got a bit of an example. This is what people think that free range should look like, roaming around in the sunshine on a nice grassy sort of area, high fence to protect from ground predators. This is probably more like what it is in a lot of cases. Close to the shed is going to be fairly devastated and no grass, but a lot of dirt and manure. And if you could see this bird up close on the bottom left, it's really not a healthy looking bird. But it's outside, so I guess it's happy. Then there's this, and this is an inside environment obviously, and it looks quite intensive, but the birds can still roam around on the floor and there's plenty of light, and it doesn't look too bad. If you're calling that a barn system, most people probably wouldn't have an issue with it. And then there's this one, which is a low sort of a ceiling, and again, there's floor space, but it's fairly crowded. That's only slightly above my head height. And you walk in there and it feels quite closed in. Many of you have probably guessed this is all one shed on one property. So the birds, in fact, are free to move around in the middle. That's right in the centre, underneath the top deck. There's it's probably inside this section here is where this photo was taken. And it goes right up and over the top and then down on the other side. And the birds are free to roam around. They can get outside. They can, if they want to, they can go out to the grass. And that's a common model for free range in Europe. It really wouldn't be acceptable in Australia at the moment. But the question, I suggest the question that people need to ask is, can the birds go outside? Are they free to go outside? And maybe a free range setup like this needs to be labelled somehow differently to say, well, this is a more intensive form of free range. If the supermarkets want that under $5 free range egg, which is what they're currently offering. This is really critical. Everywhere I went, I stopped asking farmers technical questions and going through a list. In the end, I just got there and I thought, well, I'm not going to tell you what's important to you. You tell me what you think is important to our industry. And rearing just came up time and again. Rearing. You need to rear for the type of production that you're intending to put in. So at that facility you saw of ours in the picture, in order to rear for the birds to go into that, we built this. And it's a multi-tier rearing system. So the birds start out in the middle level. When they come in as day olds, you can give them a lot of love and attention. And then as they get older, they are free to jump out of that and go split into the bottom half and then jump around and move around the shed freely. And it trains them to move between levels, and it gives them the perfect kind of the perfect preparation to go into a laying shed that's much the same. And critically, you'll find at this age they spend a lot of time on the floor. As they get older, they actually climb a lot higher, and they mostly will roost in the top level by the end, which shows that is a natural behaviour of the birds, is to roost and to climb to a higher level. And so it's something that for those people that think the birds should all be on one level, that's not necessarily letting the birds have their most natural behaviour either. Investment in training. You can't run a shed like this easily without a lot of thought and a lot of attention. You need people that know how to do it. There's the technology side, but there's also the timing. When do you let them out of different sections? When do you open up the arms on the perches and expand them to different heights? Everything's adjustable. When do you do all these things? When do you close them up and vaccinate them and all these different factors? It does take a lot of extra effort. And time and again, people emphasise to me that they had to be stockmen. That wasn't the word they used because they don't speak Australian, but they would talk about you need to be in there with the birds. It takes much more management. That was mostly the word they used, management. So you got to adjust the lights more. You got to do all sorts of things. You can't just stick them in there and hope that they'll get there by themselves. And this is the consequence. If you don't do it, you can have these horrendous situations of mortality that you would never see this in a caged shed unless you stop feeding them for days. But people get outbreaks of cannibalism and things because they haven't kept an eye on something, and so you can lose 20-30% of a flock. It's not happening all the time, but certainly it is possible. And I even spoke to a Nuffield scholar in Europe who said that in one of his previous batches they didn't trim the beaks at all, and he's doing that to try and get a premium for the egg. They get a 1 cent per egg premium, which is pretty, well, there's a lot of eggs, but it's still not great. And in return, he ended up with 15% mortality in one of his batches. And it's very difficult to avoid once they start, because it's a learned behaviour. Once they start picking on other birds and they see blood, it just continues. So, we're sort of coming right to the end. Don't panic. Keep calm and eat eggs. And that goes for all of you guys. This is something you can take home. If you want to buy barn eggs, go for it. Barn eggs are great. They're the halfway in between. The birds aren't outside. They don't have the disease risk. They're not in a cage if that's something that people struggle with emotionally. They're a good in-between option. If you think free range is your thing, go for it. Buy free range eggs. Buy branded free range eggs. You'll be giving the supermarket as much margin as what they make in gross on the caged egg, but that's your choice. And I'm very pro-choice when it comes to eggs. If you want to buy caged eggs because of the food safety side of things, the Americans are terrified about salmonella getting away from them after they go to these alternative systems, because their cage systems, they know they have the best food safety out of anything. And being a litigious society, they know there's going to be lawsuits. And so they're very worried about that. And this is probably my final recommendation or conclusion for the industry to consider, which is let the market drive us to do it. I mean, don't wait until it's too late, but don't try and second guess the market too far ahead and get in a situation where we're oversupplying in every different category and we find that we have no margin. So that's something I think with restraint, we're not a huge industry, we're reasonably consolidated. So even without collusion that's going to get us into trouble with ACCC, it shouldn't actually be that hard for us to look at where the market is going, where consumption is going. It doesn't change like that overnight, and to just expand gradually as the consumer drives the change. Because if the consumer wants something, then James' example was perfect with the turkeys. If they want it and they will pay for it, then we can afford to do it. Finally, no egg presentation would be complete without a bad egg pun. And if anyone wanted to have a crack at how many eggs are in that bottom left-hand picture, I'd be open to suggestions. That was Herbrooks' holding room in their cool room, preparing to grade on those monster big graders that I said were quite lovely. The bottom right-hand one is a winter garden, which is, in Europe, free-range eggs. Commonly, they're still called free-range, even if they only let them outside into an area like this, which isn't actually outside, it's a concrete floor. Particularly in winter. Apparently, well, the chickens, they get snow blind. This is something I didn't ever know, but if they go out on the snow and spend all their day grazing, like not grazing, but wandering around in the snow, unable to find anything to eat, they can go snow blind. So auditors turn a blind eye to them, just letting them into these partly indoor sections. Yeah. Thank you very much. I hope there are good questions. I'm hoping that because I spoke last, I'll get the toughest and most interesting questions. Is that an option? Come on, guys.